The first time I ever saw the lake, I was 8. My uncle had picked me up from a crowded apartment in the city after my parents had one of their blowout fights. I don't remember what they were yelling about. It all blurred together eventually, but I remember the way my uncle didn't ask questions. He just opened the passenger door of his dusty old truck and said, "We're going where the noise can't find us." That drive was long and quiet. No music. Just the hum of tires on winding roads and the smell of pine sneaking through the open windows. I didn't know then how much that place would matter to me, how deeply it would root itself into the parts of me I never showed anyone. When we pulled up to the cabin for the first time, it wasn't much. A single light bulb over the porch, a crooked mailbox leaning like it had a secret, and the sound of frogs echoing from the shore. But to me, it felt like another planet. A good one. One where no one screamed or slammed doors. My uncle handed me a set of keys, old brass ones on a frayed leather string, and said, "These are yours now, too." That's when he showed me the wind chime. I didn't get it then. Why hang keys that don't open anything? Now, I do. That chime has outlived storms, raccoons, a fallen tree, and a few bad memories I tried to leave behind. And lately, it's been ringing differently. Not louder, just sharper. Like it knows something is shifting. Every time I hear it now, it feels less like a welcome and more like a warning. After I got the legal notice from the HOA, I started sleeping with the porch light on. Not because I was afraid someone would show up, though that crossed my mind, but because I couldn't bear the feeling of being surrounded by shadows anymore. I'd walk from room to room, checking locks that didn't need checking, standing in doorways like a ghost in my own house. Sometimes I'd sit with my back against the kitchen cabinets, floor cold under me, and just listen. Not for anything specific, just in case. People think fights like this are just about property lines and policies, but they're not. They're about something deeper, a kind of invisible erosion. The slow grind of being made to feel like you're trespassing in your own life. Like you're always one accusation away from being taken down a peg. That does something to your spirit. It makes you small, even when you know you're right. I called my uncle's old attorney the next day. Her name was Mary Ann, and she hadn't heard from me in years. She didn't even know he had passed. Her voice cracked when I told her. I didn't mean to tell her over the phone like that, but it just came out. She said he always talked about me. Said I was the only one who ever listened to the wind. I don't know what that meant, but I wrote it down. Mary Ann still had the original documentation proving the cabin was excluded from the HOA boundaries. She'd helped draft it herself. We met in town, and she handed me a copy wrapped in a yellowing folder, edges soft from time. That paper wasn't just proof. It was a piece of my uncle. A promise that he'd tried to protect me even after he was gone. I remember sitting in the back booth of that diner after she left, holding that folder like it was a shield. The waitress came over to ask if I wanted a refill, and I nodded, even though I hadn't touched the first cup. She smiled kindly, but I saw it, the flicker of curiosity. The same kind I'd started seeing on neighbors' faces when I walked through the gas station or checked my mail. Like they knew something was going on. Like they'd picked a side, even if they didn't say it out loud. I wish I could say that paper fixed everything. That I walked up to Brad Gentry's smug little smile, waved it in his face, and that was that. But that's not how this works. People like him don't retreat when they're wrong. They double down. They twist things. They act like the law is just a suggestion. And when you fight back, they act like you're the problem. Brad didn't stop. He got louder. He started emailing threats, filing complaints with the county, telling anyone who'd listen that I was violating community safety. He called my firewood pile a hazard, said my dock wasn't up to code, said I was disturbing the peace. Even though the loudest thing I'd done in months was drop a hammer on my porch steps. Every time I tried to live like I used to, reading by the water, chopping wood, fixing little things around the cabin, I felt watched. It's hard to describe that feeling unless you've lived it. The constant sense that something is behind you, even when you know there's nothing there. The weight of unseen eyes. The way you move a little differently when you feel like you're being measured. One morning, I sat on that old tree stump again, holding the wind chime in my hands. I'd taken it down to clean it, maybe out of habit, maybe for comfort. The little brass keys were dull, cold, and one had a crack along the shaft. I ran my finger over it, and for a second, I thought about letting it fall. Just letting the whole thing break apart. It would have been easier than holding on. But I didn't. I sat there until the sun climbed over the ridge, until the keys warmed in my hand. Then I hung it back up. And as it swayed, I whispered, "I'm still here." It didn't answer, but I think it heard me. The court filings came next. Marion helped with everything. She said we had a strong case, clear documentation, false reports, harassment. I wanted to believe her. I did. But part of me, the part that had spent so many years keeping quiet to avoid conflict, wondered what it would cost, what it would take from me. I started having dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but the kind of dreams that leave you unsettled. I'd dream of my uncle standing by the lake, staring at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. Once, I dreamed I was underwater, keys floating around me like fish, and I couldn't reach any of them. I woke up gasping. That dream stuck with me. The hearing was scheduled. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends back in the city, not the neighbors who still waved politely but didn't really want to know. I kept it to myself, like it was something fragile that might shatter if I said it out loud. And then, the fifth police visit happened. It was raining. A quiet, steady drizzle. I was in the middle of fixing a leak near the chimney when I heard the tires again. That familiar rhythm on wet gravel. My stomach dropped. This time, there were 3 cars. They didn't knock. They called out my name like it was a warning. When I opened the door, they asked if I had any weapons. I said no. They asked if I'd been threatening neighbors. I laughed bitterly, I guess. I hadn't spoken to a neighbor in weeks. It didn't matter. Someone had said I was a danger. Someone had said I'd snapped, that I was unstable. The officer looked at me like he wanted to believe me, like he was tired. But rules are rules, right? That's when something in me shifted. Not broke, not shattered, just shifted. I invited them in, made them coffee, showed them the filing documents, the legal map, the photos, the complaint letters. I let them sit on my porch and listen to the wind chime while I stared at the rain. One of them, the youngest, asked how long I'd been living there. I told him the truth, long enough to know this place was supposed to be a home. He didn't say anything after that, just nodded. They left without incident. No charges, no warnings. But the damage was done. I sat on the couch that night, the wind howling like something alive outside, and I thought about all the ways people try to take things from you. Not just land or rights or peace, but your ability to feel safe, to feel rooted, to feel real. And I kept thinking of that broken key on the wind chime, the one with the crack down the middle. I hadn't told anyone, but it was my favorite, because it was flawed, imperfect, and still holding on, just like me. I don't know where this ends. I don't know what the next visit will look like, or what Brad will do when he finds out I'm not backing down. But I know this, some places remember things. And this cabin remembers me. The wind chime still sings. The lake still holds me. And the silence, the deep, ancient silence of being alone with the truth, it's no longer something I fear. It's something I own. If you've ever had to fight for something that should have been yours to begin with. If you've ever been made to feel like you were just lucky to exist in peace. Then you know how heavy a key can feel when it doesn't open anything, and how powerful it becomes when it does. This story isn't over. But now it's moving. A week after the officers left, the weather turned. It was subtle at first, longer shadows, colder mornings, but then it hit hard. Rain for 5 days straight. Not a soft, cleansing rain either. The kind that seeps through wood and memory. That presses on your shoulders like an unspoken word. Inside, the cabin felt smaller. The once warm smell of cedar and old books now seemed musty, almost sour. I stopped lighting the fireplace because the smoke curled in odd directions, as if the house itself didn't want comfort. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like a voice from a past I wasn't ready to face. That's when I started writing letters. Not to send, just to write. To the people I hadn't spoken to in years. To my mother, whose last words to me were so sharp I still flinch at the memory. To my uncle, who never asked for much but gave me everything. And one to myself, folded and stuffed in a drawer, unopened. It was in that quiet, rainy stretch that I finally saw her again. Julia. We hadn't spoken since before the fight started. She used to bring her dog down to the lake trail, and we'd talk about nothing. Books. Local gossip. How fast the seasons turned. But once the HOA mess began, she'd stopped coming by. I figured she picked a side like the rest. That afternoon, she showed up on the porch with wet hair and a Tupperware of soup. I heard about what happened, she said quietly. With the cops. I didn't believe it, but I didn't know how to say something. I nodded, unsure what to do with her presence. The part of me that wanted to shut the door clashed with the part that remembered the way she once sat beside me on the dock and asked, "Do you ever feel like you were born in the wrong story?" We sat on the porch in silence, the rain coming down in threads. She didn't push. She never had. After a few minutes, I asked, "Do you still believe in staying quiet to keep peace?" Her eyes flickered. "I used to. Then my dad got sick, and the HOA wouldn't let us build a ramp for his wheelchair. Said it didn't match community standards. He died the next spring. Couldn't leave the house the last 3 months." The silence between us thickened. "I should have spoken up back then," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't." We talked for an hour, maybe longer. She told me about growing up with a father who measured love and chores done and temper swallowed. I told her about the first time I heard my parents fight through a bedroom wall, the way I used to count the seconds between screams. There was something raw and necessary in sharing those pieces of ourselves. An invisible mirror between us. Two people who had learned to shrink to survive, now trying to unlearn the habit. That night, I found myself staring at the wind chime again. It hadn't rung all day. No breeze. Just the dead stillness of heavy air. I reached up, tapped the broken key gently. It swung a little, enough to clink against the others. Sometimes it felt like that chime was the only thing holding the story together. A talisman. A witness. It never judged, just sang. I began to wonder how many others had stories like mine. Quiet wars no one saw. Fights for identity, for space, for the right to just be. That's when I started collecting them. It started with Julia. Then a man named Luis who lived 2 cabins down. Retired firefighter. Said he got fined for repainting his own porch because the shade of green was too personal. His wife used to teach kindergarten and had a laugh like a wind-up toy. She died last winter, and he hasn't repainted since. Keeps the walls peeling on purpose now. Says it reminds him what happens when people stop being kind. Then there was Mira, who rented during summers and said she'd stopped coming because it felt like the forest was being replaced by rules. She was young, maybe 25, with paint stains on her fingertips and a quiet, restless energy. She told me she once made a sculpture out of broken keys. Said it was about people who never fit in the locks they were born into. I wrote everything down. The more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just about a cabin or a power-hungry neighbor. This was about something much older. A pattern. A machine built to crush anything that didn't conform. And then came the notice. A formal letter. Registered mail. From Brad's lawyer. A demand for removal. Accusations of ongoing nuisance behavior. A threat of litigation if I didn't comply. They included photos. Blurry shots of me walking to the mailbox. Of the woodpile. Of the wind chime. The wind chime. They called it excessive noise. I stared at that line for a long time. Something in me burned. The chime, which had hung there for nearly 20 years, through storms, winters, summers, losses, was now labeled noise. It felt personal. Like they'd reached inside and tried to rename my grief. My healing. That night, I took it down. Not because I wanted to. Because I needed to think. I laid it on the table. The keys were heavier than I remembered. I ran my fingers over them, each one worn and bent in its own way. My uncle had never told me what they unlocked. Maybe they didn't unlock anything physical. Maybe they were reminders. Each key a moment. A memory. The broken one? That was the day I didn't run when my father raised his voice. The round one with the jagged edge? That was the summer I stayed here alone for the first time. The long thin one? The night my uncle died and I couldn't stop shaking until the wind chime rang at 3 a.m. These weren't just keys. They were proof that I existed, that I had survived. And now, someone wanted them silenced. The emotional dilemma ate at me. I wanted to fight. But fighting meant more time in courtrooms. More eyes watching. More isolation. But giving in meant disappearing piece by piece. What would my uncle have done? I lit a candle that night. Not for ambience. For grounding. The kind of small flame you stare at when you need answers. I watched it flicker, watched it shape-shift with every breath. That's when I remembered something he told me once, when I was maybe 15 and didn't want to go to school because the other kids made fun of my quietness. Sometimes, being unbothered makes people more angry than yelling ever could, he said. Don't give them the fire. Give them the mirror. The mirror. The next morning, I walked down to Brad's mailbox. I stood there, on the edge of the road, and looked at the perfect lawn, the straight shrubs, the spotless porch. And I left a key. Just one. Not broken. Not new. Just true. No note. No explanation. I went back home and rehung the wind chime. It rang. Softly, but clearly. That same day, Julia called. She said people were talking. That Luis had filed a formal complaint against the HOA. That others were asking questions now. About the rules. About the lines. About what, exactly, they were protecting. The mirror was working. But it wasn't over. Brad filed the lawsuit anyway. Said I was inciting division. Said my chime was a political statement. Said my cabin was unruly. Said I was unruly. I read every page of that filing in my kitchen, rain pounding the roof, thunder rolling somewhere in the distance. I felt small, tired, but not afraid. Not anymore. Because something had shifted, not just in me, but in the air. People had started knocking again, offering food, asking if I needed anything. Not out of pity, out of recognition. They saw themselves in me. And that's where real power lies. In the moment someone else looks at your broken key and says, I've got one just like it. So, I'll go to court. I'll stand in front of whatever judge they throw at me. And I'll say what needs to be said. That some homes aren't just wood and nails. That some rules weren't made to protect, but to erase. And that some wind chimes aren't noise. They're memory. They're music. They're survival. February 2nd, the court date loomed like a storm you could feel in your bones before the sky even darkened. Every sunrise brought it closer, and yet, everything in me screamed to slow down time. Each day, I walked the cabin with more purpose, but also more fragility, like I was moving through a museum of my own life, memorizing it before someone tried to dismantle it. The trees outside stood tall, but still, their branches stiff against the windless air. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. That morning, I walked to the dock and found the lake like glass, not a single ripple. It was too calm, like the world was holding its breath. And maybe I was too. That afternoon, Luis came by. He wasn't his usual composed self. His hand shook, voice low and uneven. They threatened me, he said without sitting down. The HOA board said if I don't withdraw my complaint, they'll find violations. Said they'll make sure I regret it. His eyes were full of something I hadn't seen before, shame, maybe, or regret. He looked down at the wood beneath his feet. I'm not brave like you, he whispered. I fought fires. I've seen men die. But this kind of fight, it's different. It wears you down in slow inches. I reached for his hand, surprising both of us. You're not alone in this, I told him. But I get it. You've already lost enough. He didn't say anything, just nodded and left, shoulders curled like a man who used to walk proud but had forgotten how. That night, I found myself talking to the wind chime again. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but it was easier than talking to myself, easier than praying. I held one of the keys and whispered, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know if it's worth it. The chime gave no answer, just swayed gently in the still air. The next morning brought a letter. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper stuck into the front door. The handwriting was precise, careful. You are not what this place was meant to become. Please stop. Before someone stops you. There was no signature, no initials. But the message was clear. I wasn't just unwelcome now. I was being watched. Not just by Brad, but by whoever believed this place was theirs to define. Fear used to make me small. Used to make me step sideways, blend in, apologize before I even understood what I'd done wrong. But now it made me still, grounded, like the lake in the morning. That afternoon, Julia knocked again. I had a dream about you, she said, stepping in like she belonged there. You were standing on the dock with your arms wide open, screaming. But no one could hear you. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt too accurate. Sounds about right. She brought tea, sat on the floor like we were in college again. I think, she said, that the world teaches quiet people to make themselves smaller, so no one feels uncomfortable. But maybe that's not kindness. Maybe that's just erasure with manners. We talked for hours. She told me about the summer she almost left, when she packed a bag and sat at a gas station for 3 hours before turning back. Everyone thought I had it all together, she said. They didn't know I was breaking in a way that didn't show. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the cracks she'd hidden. I saw myself in her. That invisible mirror again. One no one wants to stand in front of until someone else does first. When she left, I wrote one more letter. This time to Brad. Not to mail, just to get it out. You're afraid. I see that now. Not of me, but of what I represent. Of losing control. Of your world being wider than you can regulate. You think order keeps people safe, but it doesn't. It just keeps them obedient. And obedience is not the same as peace. I folded it and tucked it inside the spine of one of my uncle's books. Maybe one day I'd let someone read it. But for now, it was enough to know I'd said it. The days leading up to the hearing blurred. I spent hours walking the property, touching trees, sitting in the dirt, talking to no one. Everyone kept their distance. Some out of fear, some out of loyalty to silence. But the wind chime kept ringing. And that was enough. The night before court, the rain returned. Hard. Loud. Like the sky had finally reached its limit. I stood on the porch barefoot, soaked, staring at the storm. And something inside me cracked open. I started sobbing, ugly, unfiltered, shaking sobs. The kind that don't ask for permission. Because I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for all the years I'd swallowed myself to survive. For every version of me that was told, you're too much, or you're not enough. For every child who learned to be quiet before they learned to speak. For everyone who mistook shame for humility. For everyone who needed their wind chime. Lightning split the sky, and I felt it deep in my chest. Like a truth too big for words. The next morning was cold and gray, the clouds thick but unmoving. The courthouse sat on the edge of town, a brick building that looked more like a school from the outside. I wore black, not to mourn, but to root myself. Like armor. I walked in and saw them, Brad in a charcoal suit, clean-shaven, confident. His lawyer beside him. A few board members behind, faces tight, expressions unreadable. But I wasn't alone either. Luis came. Julia too. Even Mira, paint-stained and wide-eyed. They didn't speak, just stood close. That was enough. Inside, the room felt too bright, fluorescent and unnatural. Every sound echoed. Every breath was a choice. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone. She asked us to begin. Brad's side went first. They showed photos. Read from the bylaws. Talked about unity and order and community cohesion. Used words like standard, consistency, and noncompliance. They made me sound like a problem. A threat. A virus in their system. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. I had no lawyer. Just a small notebook in my hand and truth in my throat. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't attack. I just told my story. About my uncle. The cabin. The wind chime. About the keys, each one holding a memory too human to be labeled nuisance. I talked about the silence that came before the noise. The way it breaks people from the inside. How rules meant to protect had become a cage for anything that didn't fit a mold. And I ended with this. Some of us live in houses. Some of us live in homes. This place, this chime, it's not about noise. It's about presence. It's about saying, I was here. I mattered. You don't have to like it, but you don't get to erase it. The room was quiet, not heavy listening. Even the judge leaned in. I looked over and saw Brad staring at me, unreadable. But behind that, something cracked. Just for a second. A flicker of recognition. Or envy. Or pain. Maybe he saw something in me he'd buried in himself. That's the thing about mirrors. They show us things we don't ask to see. As we waited for the decision, Julia slipped a note into my palm. You reminded me who I am. Whatever happens, thank you. I didn't cry. Not then. I held it together. But I felt the shift. Something big was coming. Not just a verdict. A turning point. The judge hadn't ruled yet. She said she needed more time. That there was complexity here worth considering. Those words echoed through my mind as I stepped outside the courthouse, not knowing whether they were a promise or a stall. The air was still heavy with rain from the night before, and the streets glistened like they remembered the storm. Luis clapped a hand on my back as we walked down the steps. Whatever happens next, he said, you didn't back down. Most people never even try. I nodded, but inside I was drifting. There's a strange kind of silence that follows when the biggest thing you've ever done is suddenly out of your hands. It's not relief. It's weightlessness. Like you're floating just above everything. Unable to touch it, to fix it, to steer. By the time I got back to the cabin, the rain had started again. Thin and constant, a quiet drumbeat on the roof. I stepped onto the porch and froze. The wind chime was gone. Not broken. Not moved. Gone. My breath left me like a punch to the chest. My hands trembled as I stepped closer, scanning the porch. No shards. No hook. Just empty space. And then I saw it, a slip of red ribbon, tied around the railing. The same kind that had once held one of the old keys. My uncle used to use them to mark what was important. What was worth returning to. Someone had taken the chime. But they left a message. I searched the property for hours. Through brush and shed and under porch beams. Nothing. Just wet earth and the hush of falling rain. Later that night, Julia came by, soaked and breathless. I saw him, she said. Brad. At the edge of your woods. He had something wrapped in cloth. Looked heavy. The words burned as they left her mouth. What did you do with it? She shook her head. I don't know. He just disappeared into the trees. That was it. That was the moment something snapped inside me, not loud or dramatic. Just a slow tear. A quiet giving up on the idea that reason could win here. I took a flashlight and went back into the woods, retracing steps that weren't mine. Every branch I pushed past felt like it was resisting me. The night was so still it almost roared. And then I saw it, half buried beneath a pile of brush near the creek, the cloth still damp and wrapped around twisted metal. I dropped to my knees. My hands moved without thinking. I peeled it open, and there it was. Bent, tangled, but unmistakably mine. The wind chime. The keys had been ripped from it. Only one remained. The oldest one. My uncle's front door key. The ribbon was frayed. The tone of the chime when I lifted it, warped, no longer harmonious. Like it was in pain. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just held it against my chest, and for a long time, I didn't move. Back at the cabin, I hung it again. This time from the inside, near the front window. No longer an offering to the world. Now, it was a shield. A quiet reminder. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the neighborhood. People became bolder. I started finding garbage left on my porch. A dead plant dumped into my flower bed. A cracked egg against my back fence. The silence that had once felt coldly polite had turned hostile. Julia stopped coming around as often. Louise stopped returning texts. And then one morning, a notice was nailed to my door. Special HOA board meeting called for emergency vote. The goal? Not just to settle the court case, but to vote on my removal from the community entirely. Eviction. Banishment. Whatever name they gave it, it was exile. I paced the porch for hours after reading it. The wind chime swayed gently behind the window, out of reach from hands that didn't know how to hold it. The storm outside hadn't lifted in days, like the sky had chosen a side. That night, I found something else waiting. Another folded note on the floor just inside the door. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten. Precise again, but rushed. Like the writer couldn't steady their hand. You've gone too far. This isn't about the chime anymore. It's about control. You're threatening something bigger. You don't know what you're in. Walk away. Please. For the first time, I felt the full reach of it. This wasn't just about property lines or aesthetics. This was about power, image, the illusion of peace. I had dragged something buried to the surface, and now everyone could see the rot beneath the foundation. I held the note up to the light. The handwriting, it was familiar. And then it hit me. Julia. The loops in the Y. The way she slanted her lowercase es. I waited for her to come by the next day, but she didn't. I went to her place, knocked twice, then again. No answer. But the door was cracked open. Just enough to hear voices inside. Hers. And Brad's. I froze. I told you I could only stall her so long, Julia said. Her voice was low but sharp. She's not what we expected. She doesn't back down. She's too visible now, Brad replied. We have to move faster. I stepped back. My chest collapsed inward, like something vital had been taken out. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers just loud enough to break you. Julia, my friend, my mirror, the one who had cried on my floor, had thanked me for reminding her who she was. And now, what? A plant? A spy? I didn't confront her. I just walked. For hours. Through rain, through mud, through memories. Through every version of myself I'd worked so hard to reclaim. I ended up back at the edge of the lake. The water was high now, dark and restless. The dock groaned beneath my weight. I sat and pulled the chime from my coat pocket. I'd taken it down again. I didn't know why. Maybe I didn't want it stolen twice. I held it in my lap and closed my eyes. The sound it made in the wind, haunting. Uneven. Like a ghost trying to sing a lullaby. I remembered what my uncle once said when I was 8 years old and afraid of being weird. Don't shrink to make them comfortable. Don't trade your edges for their quiet. The wind picked up. The chime rang. That was the echo. The loop. The line from my past that refused to die. I stood up, soaked and shaking, and made a decision. The emergency HOA vote was tomorrow. And I wasn't just going to speak. I was going to show them. All of them. Let them look into the mirror they'd spent years avoiding. That night, I went through every drawer, every box, every folder my uncle had left behind. Newspaper clippings, old board minutes, meeting notes, letters he'd never sent. And I found it, one line, buried in an old folder labeled Spring Reorg. If they ever try to erase me, remind them, this house predates their board. I was here first. I am the roots. The next morning, I walked into the community center with the chime in one hand and a file box in the other. People turned, murmured, looked away. I saw Julia at the back, next to Brad. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The room fell quiet as the meeting was called to order. Brad stood with confidence, voice strong. We are here to address the repeated violations of community standards and to vote on Ms. Lane's removal from the grounds. He turned to me. You may speak, briefly. I walked to the front slowly, deliberately, and set the chime down on the table. Then I opened the box. This isn't just my uncle's cabin, I began. It's part of this land's legal and emotional history. The foundation predates the HOA. The bylaws don't override the deeds. But you already knew that. I held up the letters. You wrote threats. You came at night. You took what wasn't yours. I turned to the room. But the worst part? You lied to yourselves. Told yourself it was about order, noise, rules. But it's not. It's about fear. About punishing what you don't understand. I looked at Julia. And betrayal? It doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's someone who pretended to see you, just to study how to undo you. She looked down. I ended with the chime in my hands. You think this is just metal and sound. But it's memory. It's presence. It's a heartbeat in the silence. I let the wind blow through the open door. The chime rang. Off-kilter. Beautiful. Broken. Just like all of us. And then I stepped back and waited. Not for their vote, but for whatever came next. Because I'd passed the point of return. And maybe that's where real change begins. The vote was unanimous against me. As Brad announced it, his voice carried that smug sharpness I'd come to expect. Per Article 12, subsection B, Ms. Lane will have 72 hours to vacate the premises. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. Because somewhere in the stillness of that room, the wind chime rang again, soft and strange, like it knew something that didn't. The meeting dispersed in murmurs, and no one looked me in the eye. Not even Julia. Especially not Julia. She stayed back, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her eyes shadowed with something that looked almost like shame. Almost. I walked out of the building without a word, the wind chime tucked under my arm, and for the first time since the storm began, the sky cracked open. A single shaft of light touched the earth like forgiveness. It didn't last. By the time I returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up again. Leaves spun across the porch like scattered letters, and the place looked like it had already begun saying goodbye to me. But I wasn't finished. I spent that night writing. Pages. Letters. Notes to people who would never read them, and to versions of myself that no longer existed. I wrote until my hands ached, and when the rain started again, I opened every window. Let the storm in. Let the walls breathe. At dawn, I carried the wind chime to the dock. The lake was still. Reflective. Like it, too, was waiting for something. I knelt, tied the chime to the post my uncle once carved our initials into. The knot was old ribbon. The last one. And then I whispered, this was never about noise. It was always about being heard. I sat beside it as the wind picked up. The chime rang, louder now, clearer. Its tone strange but beautiful, part sorrow, part defiance. I closed my eyes and leaned into the sound, letting it soak into me like a blessing or a curse. That's when I heard footsteps. I turned. Julia stood at the edge of the dock, her face pale and wet, but not from the rain. She walked slowly, like each step cost her. I didn't want it to go this far, she said. Didn't stop it, though. She shook her head. Brad came to me after your first violation notice. He told me if I helped, if I gave him access to what you were planning, he'd erase my debts, clear my fines. Said it was just a way to get you to play by the rules. But it wasn't. No, she said softly. It was about erasing your presence. You're too loud for this place, Lane. Too alive. I looked past her, at the houses lined up like tombstones. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe this place was never meant to survive someone like me. She sat beside me, wordless for a while, and we just listened to the chime. You know what's strange? She whispered. The first time I heard this, I thought it sounded like loss. Now it just sounds like memory. I didn't respond. She left without asking for forgiveness. I didn't offer any. The next day, I packed. Not just things, but stories. Paintings. Photographs. I wrapped the pieces of my uncle's life in cloth, remembering the way he once told me that love wasn't always loud. It was in what you preserved. I saved the chime for last. As I lifted it from the dock, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the older keys had returned, hung by a fresh piece of string, looped through a nail. A key that hadn't been there when I left it. I turned it over in my palm. Small. Bronze. Etched. It wasn't my uncle's. It was mine. A replica of the cabin key I'd carried since I was 16. I didn't know who had left it, or why. but I felt the message in my gut. You belong here, even if they say you don't. I locked the door one final time, wind chime in hand, and slipped the key into the soil beneath the porch, deep enough that it wouldn't be found easily. I whispered a promise to come back, or at least, to never forget. I drove out as the sun bled through a break in the clouds, the road shimmering with gold and apology. The same road I'd driven in on months ago, when everything was just beginning. A loop closed, maybe. Or just repeating. I didn't cry until I reached the edge of town, where the old oak tree stood crooked and wild, limbs clawing at the sky like they were trying to hold on. My uncle used to say that tree had more soul than half the people on the board combined. I pulled over, sat beneath it, let the wind chime rest in my lap, and then my phone buzzed. One new message. No name, just a number. Turn on channel 8. Now, my heart paused. Hand shaking, I pulled up the live stream. There, on the screen, was Brad, being led away in handcuffs. Charges of embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds, fraud. The news anchor mentioned something about a whistleblower. A hidden file. Years of cover-ups finally unearthed. The whole board was under investigation. And then I saw her, Julia, standing at the podium behind the sheriff. Eyes clear, shoulders back. She'd done it. I laughed. Actually laughed, even as tears poured down my face. Because maybe betrayal isn't the end. Maybe it's just the middle. Maybe people don't always come back clean, but sometimes they come back true. And then I noticed something even stranger. Behind her, hanging from a mic stand, was a wind chime. Mine. She'd taken it. Not to steal, but to remind them. To make them hear. The final twist didn't come until a week later, long after I'd moved into a small place a few towns over, where the HOA was more concerned with community gardens than controlling lives. I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in looping, familiar script. Inside, a photograph of my uncle, standing next to Brad. The date on the back, 1996. Underneath it, a note. It's not what you think. They started it together. Your uncle left when he saw where it was heading. Brad never forgave him for that. You were never just a nuisance, Lane. You were a threat. A living reminder that he'd failed. I stared at the photo for a long time. Everything clicked into place. The rage. The vendetta. The obsession. I wasn't fighting just for a wind chime. I was finishing a war. That night, I hung the chime outside my new window. The sound had shifted again. Softer now. Wiser. Maybe that's what happens when something survives. And sometimes, survival is the most poetic sound of all. The opening line returned to me then, full circle. I didn't expect a wind chime to change everything. But it had. Because it reminded me that being loud isn't always noise. That holding on is an act of rebellion. That memory is music. And silence? Silence is only powerful if we agree to stay quiet. I let the wind play through the chime as the stars came out, each note a little louder than the last. And I whispered the final line to myself, a truth earned in bruises and beauty, let them hear you. The mornings in the new place were different. Softer, quieter, not in a silence kind of way, but in a way that felt like breathing. The wind still moved through the trees, but now it whispered rather than warned. Lane stood by the window, her coffee warm between both palms, watching the light stretch long shadows across the garden. The wind chime, her wind chime, swayed gently outside the glass, its song mellow, like it too had aged just a little. It had been 3 months since the board collapsed. 3 months since the town meetings went public and names were read out loud like old ghosts finally being called home. Brad was still awaiting trial. Others had resigned. Some left town altogether. Julia stayed. She didn't say much anymore, but she visited Lane once, drove the full 40 minutes in silence, and just stood on her porch, eyes rimmed red. They didn't say sorry. Neither of them needed to. They just sat on the steps, side by side, and let the wind fill the spaces that words couldn't. Funny, Julia had said then, brushing a leaf off her knee. I thought I was helping them protect something sacred. Turns out, it was just wrought under wallpaper. Lane didn't reply, but she reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside it, a photo of the lake dock and a new ribbon, the same red one that once tied the first wind chime. You'll know when it's time to hang it again, she said. Now, Lane traced the rim of her cup and glanced at the table beside her. Letters. So many letters. Some from old neighbors. Some from people she'd never met, strangers who'd heard her story and wrote back in soundless solidarity. One stood out. It was from a woman in Kansas. Handwritten. Slightly smudged. Lane had read it 6 times. You reminded me that it's okay to take up space. That silence isn't peace if it costs you your voice. She folded it carefully and slid it back into the pile, heart slow and steady. Outside, the wind picked up. The chime shifted again. This time it rang in perfect clarity, the notes hanging in the air like incense, like something sacred returning home. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a boy, maybe 12, standing with a wind chime in his hand, a curious look in his eyes. Behind him stood his mother, smiling nervously. "Is this yours?" he asked. "It blew into our yard." Lane blinked. "No," she said softly, taking it from him. "But it was meant to find me." The boy frowned. "How do you know?" She crouched to meet his eyes and held the chime between them. "Because some things don't show up until you're quiet enough inside to hear what they're saying." He nodded like he almost understood. He looked back at his mom, then back at Lane. "It sounds like a secret," he whispered. Lane smiled. "Maybe it is. Want to know how to listen better?" He nodded. She pointed to the sky. "Close your eyes. Now breathe in, slow. That breeze? That's the voice of everything you thought you lost." He grinned, wide and young and true, and ran back down the path. Lane looked down at the new chime. It wasn't like hers. This one had pieces of sea glass and driftwood, tied together with twine. Delicate, but strong. She hung it beside her own. The two chimes clinked once, then settled into a rhythm, like strangers becoming neighbors. The sun began to sink behind the hill. Gold spilled across her porch. She sat on the step again, arms around her knees, letting the air wrap around her like an old quilt. It was in this quiet hour that everything always made the most sense. She thought of her uncle, of how he built the cabin not to escape the world, but to remember how to live in it. He used to say, "Peace isn't silence, it's knowing you're safe enough to be loud when you need to." Lane reached for the small box beside her. The one with all the leftover keys, some real, some symbolic, all worn with stories. She picked one at random, ran her thumb over its rough edges. Then she slipped it into her pocket and stood. She didn't know where she'd go next, but she knew she'd bring that key, just in case she met someone who needed to be reminded that they still had one. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with strokes of purple and rust. Somewhere behind her, the kettle whistled low. She let it whistle. She stepped off the porch and walked barefoot into the grass, the blades cool and wet from the evening dew. The wind played in strands of her hair. The chimes behind her danced. Lane tilted her head to the sky, breathed deep, and whispered something only the wind could carry. "You don't have to be quiet to be loved." The trees responded in hushes. The earth shifted gently beneath her, and the stars began to arrive, one by one, like promises slowly kept. In the distance, another wind chime answered. Someone else had hung one. Someone else was listening. Somewhere, maybe right now, someone is standing in a room they were told they don't belong in. Someone is staring at a blank wall wondering if their voice matters. And maybe, just maybe, this story will reach them. Maybe it'll be the wind chime that makes them stay. Because silence isn't the enemy. But forgetting you deserve to be heard, that's the real theft. And maybe, the chime doesn't sound the same to everyone. Maybe that's the point. What did it sound like to you?